Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. Thank you for joining today's Modern Sales Pros Masterclass on data-driven customer success. I'm really excited to be here today with Boris. He is a fellow Microsoft refugee, an immense amount of passion for data, and just all-around great guy. Boris, MSP tradition, before we jump into the content, which is phenomenal, have you picked up any new hobbies since the start of the pandemic, or have you gotten better at an old one?
I think I could name two. One that I'm proud of, one not. I've been cycling a lot more, and it's weirdly enough, cycling through San Francisco has become more enjoyable, right? Now that it's more devoid of cars. So I've been doing that a lot more. That's been kind of my activity. And then one thing that we never used to do at our house was make cocktails, which we have started to do. So, but we're still very rudimentary about it in that we haven't really bought the fancy equipment. So it's a lot of like shaking it with a chopstick, you know, like that kind of stuff. But like the outcome is perfectly good.
Well, adapt and overcome. I think that's good. So what's your go-to cocktail? So when we can be not socially distant, what would the go-to cocktail be at the Boris household?
That is a very good question.
No pressure. No pressure.
That's maybe maybe a sidecar or a Sazerac, like one of those.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know that maybe as simple as a Negroni, because like it's not super sweet. Basically, I don't like my drinks overly sweet. That's what I've learned about myself.
That's an important thing to realize, especially during pandemic when you can try 4, 5, 6 different cocktails over the course of a week.
Yeah. What about you? First of all, is cocktails in your repertoire?
So my go-to is whole fruit margaritas. So I have a Vitamix, and here's a pro tip for everybody. With a Vitamix, it can obliterate anything that you put in there just about. So take a bunch of navel oranges, peel them, freeze them. Take a bunch of limes, peel them, freeze them. That becomes your base, a little bit of ice, maybe 2 or 3 shots of tequila, blend it. It's phenomenal because you're getting all of the fruit. It's not just the juice, you get the fiber too. So you end up really great drinks, really good, especially for a time like this in San Francisco when it's a little bit tropical from a weather standpoint. That's a good go-to. Also make a really, really, really mean Moscow Mule. I gotta throw that one out there. Easy, but nice. Classic.
Yeah, that's true. That's good. That's a classic. Yeah. I was going to say, if your blender is that good, I feel like you should throw the rind in there while you're at it. I mean, come on. If you're going to really fast.
I mean, it's just, we're getting everything in there. Why
then
not?
We need the fiber. Right? There's a pandemic. Then you really get the fiber.
Why does this taste a little bit pithy? I think there's something wrong with your tequila.
It's just like, all right. For a while.
Let's jump into this, and certainly we can continue the conversation about cocktails, but also fun is data-driven customer success. So before we jump into this, just a few words about Modern Sales Pros. Boris, if you take us forward one slide, please.
Yes.
Modern Sales Pros, for those of you who know, is the world's largest revenue leadership community. And we have an amazing community filled with managers in sales and folks and leaders in sales and revenue operations, customer success, account management, and the related disciplines. The great part about our community is it's there for you as a resource to help you answer questions you would otherwise struggle to solve on your own. So you can look to your left, look to your right, ask a question like, what the hell is data-driven customer success? And lo and behold, the community will provide insight into that, whether through an event like what we're having here today with Boris and the team from Census, or through great online discussions in our online forum. You drop a question, you get perspective from across the ecosystem of all of these different organizations have members in the community. For those of you who aren't members, who are interested, we'll get you added shortly after here. And today's data-driven customer success programming wouldn't be possible without the sponsorship of the team from Census. I'll kick it over to Boris to say just a few words about Census.
Thanks, Rich. There we go. So Census is a data platform to help sales and general ops teams get data about their customers into the hands of their success team, their sales team, eventually even their marketing and support teams. And the way we think about it is, increasingly companies have data all over the place. And in particular, the importance of product data has risen so much now that, we live all at home and every application is becoming product led. And we're really just trying to help companies capture that information and surface it to the right user at the right time.
That's awesome. I think it's great. And we know the proliferation of data is very, very real. And that's why we're excited to talk data-driven customer success today. So Boris, if you advance us one slide here.
Yeah.
Just a few housekeeping notes. First on today, be sure that you do take a second and fill out the poll here. This is going to help Boris and I shape our conversation that we're having. And if you don't know where to go to get data in your organization, that's okay. There's an option for you too. Secondly, please do use the Q&A panel. We've got some good programming here. We're going to be fielding questions throughout. And then we'll also have time at the end for the Q&A panel. In the Q&A panel, you can upvote. If somebody asks a great question, just go, hey, +1. You want to put a comment on it, go ahead and do that as well. And then finally, because I know it's the first question we get asked every time, the recording will be made available. It's usually about 24 hours after the event. You'll see the recording up on the Modern Sales Pro's previous event page. It'll be up on our YouTube channel and all of that. But I'm really excited to meet a fellow ex-Microsofty, startup man extraordinaire. Boris, thank you again for this sponsorship. I'm excited for the conversation here today. But why don't we give a little bit of background to folks before we jump into the meat and potatoes here?
Yeah, I like being classified as a refugee right out of the bat. So as we learned about each other, I started my career at Microsoft. I am a kind of a lifelong product person, kind of technical background, computer science background, but always spent my time in product. And after quite a few years working on developer tools at Microsoft, which is an interesting, kind of hybrid of customer facing and very internal facing. So it's one of the few places where product people actually are probably better equipped to talk to customers than salespeople, since the customer is themselves an engineer. So I developed an affinity for talking to users, and I then left. Now it's over 8 years ago to start my first company, where we helped startups, actually, a lot of startups in the Valley and around the world, to help kind of unify all their employee data. And so I became a nerd about unifying data and dealing with data silos, which has, I think, slowly but surely become my brand. And now, at Census, we're just obsessed with the same problem, just around customer data and the fact that it's all over the place and it's not necessarily unified, and just trying to help companies get that right. So I'm a longtime MSP lurker. I'm trying to reverse that now and provide, give back more to the community than I've gotten from it.
Well, and it's certainly something where, as we were talking about in the prep session, like the proliferation of tools that we have access to as revenue leaders. I mean, it's growing exponentially, not quite as fast as maybe marketing technology, but still very, very quickly. And with this, I think the part too that's interesting is this fragmentation ends up really impacting the customer experience and our ability to service that customer. So I'm excited for this chat. Boris, I'm going to let you take it away. I'll pop in with questions from now and then, but please, everyone, thank you, Boris, again for joining us and sharing this with us. We're excited to hear it.
Yeah, I'll echo one thing Rich said there that I could not agree with you more, and I assume everyone in our families would also agree, is there is nothing worse as a customer, right, than dealing with a company that doesn't seem to know the things about you that you've already told them. It's by the way, it's how I explain to my parents what we do, because God knows you can't explain, low-level data, transformations and moving data around.
It's just like a networking reference table. I mean, come on, Boris.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, mom and dad totally understand that. But I feel like it's a pain that everyone has experienced, and it's shocking that it hasn't gotten better. So I'm glad to try to help companies get slightly better at it. Cool. Well, speaking of the kind of the topic today is data-driven customer success, but for me, I wanted to kind of narrow, for the sake of conversation today, as to certain aspects of the job to be done by customer success teams. I think there's a lot of roles they can play, and there's a lot of ways in which the separation between an account management team and a CS team can be subtle and potentially unique to your company. But in this case today, I was thinking a lot about, these four things, which is a team that helps adopt your product. So actually helps drive adoption of your product, both during onboarding and even beyond. For potentially if you have, land and expand kind of aspect to your product. Two, actually educating users on how to use the product and be the most successful with it. And then, three and four, kind of the Cain and Abel twins of yin and yang of this, which is very much, finding opportunities to grow into an account, as well as ensure that the opposite doesn't happen, right? That people don't leave the whole product as a whole or reduce their usage, et cetera. And so I've been thinking about this aspect of customer success in particular. And when I think about that, I think, well, how do you solve that day to day as a customer success team? So if you're a customer success rep, like, how do you solve this? You would ask yourself these questions, right? You would say, well, what company that is assigned to me should I focus on? Are they using feature A, feature B, feature C? And really included in that is, do I even have a definition of feature A and feature B and feature C? Which is interestingly not always obvious, and we can talk about that. Is the company that I'm focusing on, are they using all the seats that they've purchased? Is seats even the right metric? Potentially it's a different metric, around usage or kind of volume, something. But are they close to it? Are they at the bottom? Are they exceeding the number? Who needs help, right? Who actually has raised their hand, and who is potentially has not but needs help, right? And then again, the flip side of that, who do I know that's actually really active and borderline a power user that I can use to grow or to identify new opportunities, potentially even use them as a referral? There's all these things that you could do if you knew who your power users are. And then, take not just the users you know about, but users you should know about within an organization. All these things are, I think this is just a selection, but I think of all these as really good questions that a CSM is probably trying to answer on a day-to-day basis, rather than, once a quarter. And so how do you do that? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, Boris, just a question on this. How have you seen this evolve since the start? We'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the pandemic. How has this changed or morphed, or is it pretty much the same, but there's just more emphasis on it?
No, I've definitely seen some morphing. So I'll give you a couple of examples that I've noticed. So one is some kinds of businesses, and we're lucky, I think this is, also the important preamble that, like, we get to work with some companies that have been extremely blessed during the pandemic, that their usage has ballooned, right? So I'm thinking, for example, of a video company whose, the user base has just exploded. But for them, in a way, the problem has exacerbated because they genuinely cannot serve everyone in the way they did before. So the need to prioritize, that first bullet, has become an order of magnitude more complicated, more difficult, and yet more essential, because now they have, borderline like 100x the users. So that, I think, I've noticed. I think companies have become a little bit more product-led during the pandemic, right? You're not able to go to the trade show. You're not able to build the relationships over there. So which means that your product is often the first connection to a customer, more than the conference that you and I would have gone to. And which means that building the relationship starts from a different point. So that's shifted, I feel like, during the pandemic. And so, like, even, one of the things that we do, I think about, today I'm going to talk a lot about the quantitative, but I think a lot about the qualitative as well. And, we create shared Slack channels with a lot of our enterprise customers. And, so you try to create a rapport there, because I think building rapport is also super important to do this job well. And I think a lot of that has changed. On the plus side, I think everyone is much more comfortable being open about their personal life. And, like, I wouldn't be surprised if something walks by behind me and everyone's going to be, like, totally okay with that. So I think those are the things I've noticed in this domain. I'm probably missing some, but at least those I've definitely noticed.
I think it's certainly a question that we've seen a lot of folks look at from the management standpoint. We spend a lot, and in MSP, very data driven, right? We spend a lot of time, are our sellers doing the right things? Are they doing enough of the right things to advance? And that was important before, but now when I can't go walk over, Boris,
Right.
how you doing with the Sendoso deal or whatever it might be? Now I've got to trust the data a little bit more. I like this, and just to set context, it's good to see it from the other perspective, right? But what is the customer, what's the buyer going through, and how the role data plays in making that world
Yeah.
class.
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, I think you're totally right about the, you know, kind of just the heartbeat within your company is much harder to do in the old way. And I think we've all grown tired of just sitting in Zooms, you know, for hours on hours. So yeah, I think you've got a really good point there that there's a whole aspect of being data driven on the management side as well. That hopefully to make your team happier, not more annoyed. But then you end up with the entering data aspect problem. But I think Atrium does a lot to solve for that too. Totally. Okay, that was a great question. Yeah. So regardless of, you know, pandemic or not, I think for a lot of these questions, when I go into companies, and a lot of this, you know, when we started tackling this problem, we went in with a beginner's mind and just trying to see what companies are doing. And invariably, you see this, which is, you know, what we've colloquially referred to as the, you know, the 5 tabs of doom, which is to answer those questions. You have the information. We live in an amazing time, right? Where you have your billing platform has a website, and like all these things have a website, but you have to go to each one, right? Like, did they talk to support? Well, let's go see in Zendesk. What have they done in the product? Well, let me go see. I think we have a support console. Maybe I can go look over there. Oh, and then we did this one-off export into Google Sheets that like someone maintains on the ops team. Let me go there, right? All of this is kind of what we see day to day. And on the one hand, if you wanted to be optimistic, you could say, well, look, we have all this data about our customers. It's sitting in all these places. But in my mind, you know, being data-driven doesn't mean you have data all over the place. It means that you're actually able to be smart about how you use the data, right? And that's a lot of how we've seen, you know, helping customers, but also the people that do this well is what we've been able to observe as well. And for sure, it starts with having access to information. That's obviously the baseline that you need. But then putting it into action is the really interesting problem that we work with companies all the time to see what a good practice is.
And I think, Boris, now is probably a good time. Let's see our poll results to see if folks know where to go in their organization to get data before we talk about how. All right.
Sweet.
Only a few folks didn't know. That's good. That's good. But sales ops, right? Data, Excel, of course. It's going to end up in Excel usually anyway.
Listen,
good context.
As the 2 Microsoft guys in the room, obviously, it's all companies are a distillation of Excel or vice versa. It is the ultimate else statement for everything, right?
It's a fabulous. I'm a big fan, and I didn't appreciate the difference between Excel for Mac and Excel for Windows until I had my first Mac. Oh, big difference if you're an Excel power user.
Oh my, yeah, it is really something.
Oh my God, we sound like such data nerds right now. Just like, oh yeah, Excel.
Listen, you got to use the best formulas. It's like
you got to do it, right.
No, it's good to know the sales ops team is there for most people for answering these questions. So that's really, really good. It's by the way, that's in itself, I think, an interesting evolution that I think you're noticing and that I've noticed is the sales ops team is gone from, I think, answering one-off questions to being really the focal point for getting all your data. And so they themselves, I think, are trying to think about this problem. And if anything, a lot of the takeaway here could be about how to have a CS team and a sales ops team work in perfect synergy so that you're actually driving way better results. So what does that mean?
The other part, yeah,
ahead,
I think that's yeah. No, I was going to say the important part about that too. We see this transition amongst the sales ops discipline from like an order taker and report provider to an information strategist. I'm going to walk into the board meeting not with the report, but I'm going to have a recommendation because this is what the data says.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I am happiest when I see that evolution in our users, right? I think of that as less as a customer and more as the person, right? The people using our software, like if that's the change that you get to experience as a person in your job, I think that's really something, right? From one-off, like, let me answer this question in Excel today, and then let me do this tomorrow. And like, I don't know what's going to happen the next day, to let's think strategically and let me push this to the board. It's really empowering and also better. So to that point, to me, it's you want to move from there's lots of places to go get the data to how does the data enable my customer success team to do these things well? So what does it mean to do these things well? On the one hand, it's, helping you focus on the right users, right? Having a bunch of tabs open does not help you do that. Making sure you don't ask customers questions that you don't need to ask them, that are already known to you in the company somewhere, that you want to do that in line, right? Wondering whether your data is up to date, right? Like those are things, these are all ways in which a good data system helps you be more productive, right? As a customer success team. This is yeah. So there's a lot you can do to start. I don't even think this is necessarily that you need to have a million data points to do this. The key is to think about it in terms of this lens, and even to start with even one piece of data that can help you do this, right? There's a lot of how I talk to customers who are just trying to get started, who don't necessarily have a million data points.
I think that's, and it's an important point to start by starting. So that was a great answer there. I think the other piece I would add, this is a question coming in from Karen, like, we don't have a ton of data. Where the heck do we start? Well, start by starting, but also it goes back a little bit further into your CS strategy. Or is the strategy of your team to drive adoption of feature A? If you're going to drive adoption of feature A, how are you going to measure success of that? It becomes almost this product or strategy question.
Exactly.
That then the data can help you answer it, right?
I think, it's a classic problem. To be fair, I think, probably the number one thing that happens when I go into a customer is, wouldn't you like? I just show them an example dashboard of a customer success team, and they rave about it, and they're like, we need that usage data, and they don't know where it is, right? That was the reason for the poll question, and there's absolutely, good, better, best. And I think to get started, there are ways to engage with the product team, the engineering team, the data team, such that you get what you need. And they'll understand the value. And especially now, right, as people think about growth and they think about that holistically, I personally, if your company even has a growth team or a product person that thinks about growth, the second most important thing after the product is the customer success team, in my fairly not so humble opinion. And so the key is to partner with them as opposed to being a tax on that team, right? And then you can get a lot more data, flowing your way. And then of course, I'll show you how products like ours can also help make that possible. So I wanted to talk a bit about this in the concrete, right? So it's all well and good to talk about those concepts, but our users have actually done really interesting things, and I wanted to shine a light on three of them. I have to go with Atrium because it's one of our favorites, and it's like this is MSP, so it feels like the perfect company to talk about. One of the things you'll notice is that all these companies are very product led and have a lot of usage data to begin with, but most of the things that they do for enabling customer success are actually very applicable to almost anyone. So the first thing that I've seen these companies do, and all these examples apply to each one, but I'll pick one at a time. So the first was, just getting this idea of how active are the users. So Atrium wanted to make sure that they knew for every user how active they were in the product. So that was like step one. And define activity, of course, is an important concept, and we can nerd out about that. But at a high level, they wanted to know which users are active. And then they were able to sync that into their CRM and see that relative to the title of the person, right? So now every CSM has a single dashboard of all their users, and they can see by role how active they are. And there are roles in Atrium, right, which is a sales performance management tool, for people who don't know, that should be extremely active in the product, and some that are like, it's acceptable for them to be less active. And so if you see a discrepancy there, you know exactly who to talk to. And then you go one step further and you say, well, Atrium has like 3 core features, one for the rep, one for the manager, and now they pulled out usage. They basically took usage from those 2 features, put them into their CS dashboard. And now they have at a glance, like the ability to know by persona and by feature, who's not using or who is using. And the output of that is really simple. It's either an alert for, we need to do something, or it's actually an alert to, we need to sell them something, right? Like there's actually an opportunity for them to use this new feature that they don't even realize that they could be using. Or it's the opposite of like, they're going to turn off our product because they're not using the most valuable part of it. So let's engage them. So those are some of the ways in which I think Atrium was able to take its success team and make them more effective and more data driven. We've seen some of these other ones like Figma have piped into their customer success team information about their admin users, right? So in Figma's a design tool, but it's a team product. And the admin user of a team is really the champion. And they know that, right? They know that after all these years of having their users, they've kind of identified that. I mean, it could change over time, by the way, but and so you could adjust it. But they have this understanding that the admin is this interesting champion. And so they've piped in and have automated alerts for when the admin leaves or if the admin changes. And they know that to be a trigger to engage that new persona, right? Because otherwise the account may start to deteriorate. So it's as simple as like, identifying that as a concept, which is not very complicated once you've known it, and then piping that and alerting on that automatically. Another thing that I've seen is around, it feels like personalization, but at the end of the day, it's really about being effective in using data to do this. So you see this, that's two of these actually, I think Notion and Figma both do this, is tagging users that based on things that they've done. So that when they have conversations down the road, they have this information at their fingertips. So this is, Rich, to the point we talked about at the beginning around like, you should not have to ask questions about things customers have already said. This happens a lot at high scale companies. They'll hit the point where a user will bring something up in any context. Potentially it's a support context, potentially it's a success context, potentially it's just a random conversation in some way. And that knowledge, there's a bit of information there, like I really need this to work in Firefox, so something like that can be captured, or they're raising their hand about like an enterprise feature. And the way companies do that normally is they'll be like, let me go into Slack, let me find the person on the team who might be responsible for that, if I know who that is, and they'll just email them. That's that data gets lost, you might not connect. It genuinely does not scale past a very small number of people, both in terms of your company and your users. And so the way they solve it is the person whose job it is to notice that, all they have to do is record it, right? And they record it with these tags. And then those tags are synced across all of their tools. And so later on, when you're trying to understand who needed that, you have that information at your fingertips. So those are like 3 examples of real things people are doing to be more specifically data-driven. All of this is about centralizing information and then bringing it to the fingertips of a customer success team.
And how do you, you kind of touched on it a little bit there, but it's worth double clicking into. So much of what customer success do is this really hard, like, have they used feature X
right.
N times in a month? And I think that's what makes them valuable. How do you lever in the qualitative aspects of it?
Yeah.
We spent a lot of time on the quantitative side. Where does the qualitative component fit into?
Totally. And I think that example I just gave is a great, kind of variant on that, right? Which is, I think you absolutely need qualitative information about your users. And you can get it lots of different ways. That's the other thing. To go back to your point about proliferation of tools, there are lots of ways to capture it in the first place. Like maybe you're doing surveys, maybe you're doing conversations, maybe you have a monthly check-in, just broadly speaking, but you need to record them. And the way to do this well is to at least attempt to bucketize this information. It's not always easy. And a lot of times it's like the easiest thing to do is just record some notes and paste them into something and then you're done, right? But if you can bucketize even a little bit, then you can store that in the data, and you can keep it in. You can store that where you work, right? So maybe you're doing that in your survey tool, or maybe you're doing it in your CSM tool, or you're doing it in something else, right? And you're just taking the notes down. Support people tend to do this in their own tool, like Intercom or Zendesk or something like that. But if you can bucketize it into this concept of like, think of it as a tag, then with a not the most sophisticated, but a mildly sophisticated system like what we help companies set up, you can help those be made available to more places. And then you can start to count this stuff, right? And so it's what people have been doing for years on product features, right? People have deployed, what is it, user voice, how many years ago now? And there's lots of user voice competitors now too. And the whole point there is like you're letting the users bucketize for you. That's really what you're doing in user voice, is like there's a search box and the users will bucketize. But the point is you can actually now take that and you now have this thing that's like, well, it has 100 votes, and you're able to be more thoughtful about prioritizing features. It's the same for this kind of problem. So if it's, they asked for a feature that's an enterprise, let's take the most famous classic one, SSO, right? Since that's where I came from before. Customers will bring it up. Maybe they'll bring it up in the wrong context for that person to do something about it, but you should still record it, right? Say like wants SSO or SSO requested or enterprise feature requested. There's a million ways to bucket. Don't overthink it. Just start with something. And then you can link that back later on, right? And said, well, who are the customers that have asked for this? And it could have come from 3 different places. Who cares? But it's in your dashboard now, and you're like, I'm going to do some prospecting, internal prospecting into that. So that's how I've seen it done, and I think it can still evolve. Right? I think that's just a way to do it. But I definitely think you still want to have the human connection. There's things that I've been thinking about, like maybe you can even kind of score internally yourself on like, how well do I know my customer, and just kind of maintain that as an internal metric. But that gets exotic.
Yeah, I mean, it also seems like too on that front, there's a point of diminishing returns, right? So I love the point that you make about making sure, hey, if I'm the user and I've requested the enterprise feature to my CSM, and then someone else is running with the renewal, if they don't realize that there's people in the account that want that enterprise feature because it came in qualitatively, right? It was in our biweekly check-in, Boris.
Exactly.
That's a very, very valuable way to help that person be better at their account management or renewal process or upsell motion.
Yeah. And I think it's one of those, this goes back into probably the day-to-day life of a sales ops person. I think there's such an emphasis on, historically, is like, well, it's not one of the things in our checkbox, in our dropdown, right? It's like closed won or closed lost. Here are the 12 reasons. And if it's not one of those, nothing you can do. And I think the mentality, I think that is, and you don't have to be unbelievably fancy about it, but if you can just capture it in a way that is then can be pulled out later by something that is not just, an AI that needs to read a whole text, then you've already done you're already like a whole step function better than what you were. And then tooling can be slowly but surely layered onto it, right? And as you and I like to say, technically Excel is one of those solutions, but it doesn't yet have the AI, right? That just tells you, this is what they said. I got it.
Someday soon. And then folks, we've got some questions coming in here. These are great questions. Keep them coming. I'm going to let Boris go for a little bit here and roll through a couple of last pieces of content, but please do use the Q&A panel, upvote the questions, thumbs up the questions you think are really interesting, and we'll have a ton of time at the end for that. So please do keep them.
Cool. So the thing I wanted to just touch on is how do we as a company enable people to connect the dots? And what I'm saying here can be done, without us. This is just like the way in which we think you should work with your broader team to make something like this happen. So remember, the key that I've highlighted here is the data needs to be at the fingertips of the CSM, right? You want to avoid the 5 tabs. And 2, you want to make the data actionable so you could potentially, automate some of these things so you don't have to wonder every day, who are the top 5 customers I should call, right? And broadly speaking, the way you should think about this in your organization, and always curious to see if people have very different mental models, is, you have a product team, you have product code, you have engineers, you have product people. All of that is generating data. In most modern companies, there is a data exhaust out of that. There's also a data exhaust out of your internal tools, right? Out of your CRM, out of your support tool, all of which generally tends to land in a pool of data. People tend to call these lakes nowadays, but it doesn't matter. You may or may not have a data team. But there's definitely a BI function or something, right? Or your sales ops team is doing this, but you can think of it as like it's collecting all in one place. And then the idea is to then allow you to map that data to where people are doing their work, right? And so that's what Census does for companies, right? we basically help connect, between, if you think of that pull from earlier, right, of you want to have a CS team that is effective with this data at their fingertips. So you need two things, right? You need the data to be accumulated somewhere, transformed, and then connected back to where you're working. And that's what Census does. And then the tools are growing all the time, right? I think the MSP community probably can name more tools than I can, even though it's kind of my job to know them all. But Gainsight has been the kind of de facto standard for some time. But even that is like one silo among many. And we just used a bunch of examples, you and I, in this conversation around, you might have a separate survey tool. Your support team is technically feeding data into this as well. And you have new customer success tools kind of popping up these days as well. All of this is kind of what we can connect to. And one of the things I like to remind people is you don't need to buy all that stuff to get started, right? I'm going to steal your line there, Rich, again, of like, just start by starting. And a lot of our customers, the first thing you do is just get it into your CRM. You probably already have Salesforce or something like it. And you can build your first customer success process and approach right there. And evolve over time, of course. But I think this mindset of like, let me get a few pieces of data, let me use them to prioritize my team. It doesn't mean you need to go buy 20 tools, right? And it doesn't need to be necessarily a 9-month project. It really can start small. And that's a lot of what we do with customers. I've been continually amazed that people will take my smallest demo of our product and actually start with that. And it's great. It's an order of magnitude better than not having that, right?
I want to just pull on one part that Boris said there, because I think in MSP, right, we do have this tendency of like, oh, what's the best tool? What tools do I need? What tools do? And there's a lot of this that you can do, and you don't need to buy a CS stack that has 15 or 20 tools in it. You can get started today with just a few and get really good at your process there. And I know we won't hit on this too much here, Boris, but if you have all of this data and it's all information and it's not being used, you've spent a bunch of time doing something that's maybe not the most highest leverage set of activities you could do. Capture the data you need, learn from it, iterate, and grow. Don't try to do it all in one fill.
Totally. And let me be clear. A proliferation of tools is perfect for me, right? Like that is, I'm very self-serving here. It's like the more tools there are, the better for Census, because that's the whole kind of point. But I'm trying to make sure people kind of make progress on this front, right? And I'm a big believer that, start with a few metrics, start with a few tools, and go from there. There's so much to improve over time. And a lot of this, it's easy for us to pontificate, I think, but some of this really will be bespoke to your organization, right? Your customer shape, your ASP, your strategy, your weird feature design, your weird product design. Maybe it's like, we've seen some really unusual things that if I had given one piece of advice and not been flexible, it would have been wrong for them, right? It really does depend on your company eventually, which is good. You should have some intelligence within your company too. So the thing, and this is actually a great segue even to this, right? Which is, you don't have to jump all the way to magical, all these amazing tools. But I do think the key of being data-driven and having the right focus is to be able to move from dashboards to some kind of alerting and automation. And because if you think of it as like the evolution that I see is like, you start with those, the 5 tabs of doom, and then you say, well, okay, let's centralize. Let's pull out the information that we care about. Let's put that where we live, right? So maybe it's the CSM, you have a CSM tool, maybe it's a Salesforce report. And now you have a dashboard, right? Now you can say, well, I can sort this and I can see who's at risk, who is a power user. Now I can do that at a glance. That's a huge improvement. And then, if you want to get even more effective, right? Again, relative to number of customer success reps to users, or just generally make your job less. You don't necessarily want your job every day to just be like staring at a dashboard and picking line items. You can then take that same capability and just expand that, right, to alerting and automation. Because it's the same. Now you have it all at one place. You have it. Those are the metrics you care about anyway. So instead of saying, let me sort through a dashboard, it's really not that much work to go, and now just email me when usage in that dashboard drops below a certain number. And now you've turned it into like proactive. And to me, that's the evidence that your team has gone from being, let's say non-existent to average to great is, having data is the first step, but being genuinely proactive is the superpower, right? Your customers will love you for just being aware of them. Like having the customer 360 information, like not having to repeat themselves is like, that should drive customer sat. But the superpower is to be proactive, right? Like you really don't want to be the person looking at lagging indicators of like churn, like a net revenue. You don't really want to be looking at the billing data, right? You want to be looking at this data and acting on it before it becomes an interesting problem. Like take that Figma example I gave. Like just knowing that an admin user changed is such a small thing, but it totally changes how you're tracking the problem and when you're engaging the user, and probably when it's 10x more effective and more useful. So these are the kinds of outcomes that you want to look for, is really the way you want to think about it. And so in case you weren't paying attention at all, right? So if this is the, the short of it, if like you really weren't paying attention, is you want data in your CS function. I really do think it's the function in the company that needs data, if not the most, the second most, right? After your growth and product team, who really better be data driven, although you never know these days. And there's like multiple reasons, right? So just to reiterate, one, your team will be more productive, right? Which as a rep, that's good. As a manager, you can increase your account to CSM ratio, right? That's what data enables you to do. Your CS team can be proactive, right? You can avoid churn before it's like nearing like the event. And I don't know, for me, my favorite part is like both sides are happier, right? You as a CS team is happier and your customer is happier because you're not asking them like what you should already know. And none of this is really rocket science. You don't need a huge budget to get started. You don't need a huge data team to get started. Like we can work with you, and oftentimes having even just like one person there who's thinking about this is enough to get the wheel kind of turning.
Let's take some questions, and we got a couple coming in here, and these are phenomenal. And folks, please do use the Q&A panel, upvote the ones that are in there right now. I actually want to start with Alex Kaufman. This is a great question, and as a former product guy who went and built his own company, I think you're going to have a really good perspective on this. Alex's question is, how do I differentiate between a client request for a feature that will actually improve, right, the product or service, right? It's like worth it for us to build as a product team versus something that's a nice to have and maybe not worth it as much.
Oh, that's a talk all in its own. I mean,
yeah.
The first thing is like, I don't think people are that good at that. Let's be first brutally honest. I don't think people are that good at that. So that's one. Two, I think the way people think about it at a super high level is, does it fit into like strategic new things? So they're not even thinking about it in the low level, they're thinking about it in the really high level. Like, well, does this unlock enterprise? Does this move us closer to that vision that the CEO had of like becoming this thing, right? So they'll bucket them in that, right? They'll look for, does it fit into some kind of super nebulous high level qualitative strategy? That's how I think the world does this, broadly speaking. But I do think there are ways to be a lot more rigorous about this. Now, I don't think it's easy to do kind of trivially. Like you kind of have to invest in this a little bit. But the high level is this. You should slowly but surely be instrumenting your application, right? And instrumenting your customer data, like from the other side, from your revenue, like billing system, from your customer success side, right? All of this, you have to be a consumer and a producer of this data. And then when the data is all over time co-located, and this is the trend we see that's starting to happen, which is so powerful, which is like everyone's kind of merging, like dumping all their data in one place, which is this, high level speak, the data warehouse is this great place to do that. And you can invest in a data team to manage that, which is, well, now that you have it all there, you can start to do regressions. You can start to do some analysis on, did this have an effect? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you can know a priori for every feature. right? Like, will it have that kind of impact? So that you still have a chicken and egg problem there. But I think the team can get a lot smarter over time if you can measure impact of a feature. And by and large, I think people don't, honestly. The only people who do this really well are like super high-end growth teams at super high-end consumer companies. Like, that's the high bar, right? Like the Facebooks and the Ubers do this well. I'd even say B2B SaaS companies are still like learning how to do this, even on the product and growth side, and let alone the broad like number of companies. So I don't think I gave a perfect answer for here's how you do it, but I do think there's hacks, and then there's slowly but surely is accumulating the information and measuring.
I think there's a fine answer, because it's kind of a how long is a piece of string. It's a very challenging, multifaceted problem. The other piece I would add to this too, and this is something we've seen this discussion a lot in modern sales pros. Alex, when a customer says that they want a feature or need a feature, it's important for the CS team and the product team to figure out, like, are they just asking for that? Are they giving you a solution to a different problem, or are they actually giving you the best solution for their problem? And that's a part where I've seen, especially frontline AEs and CSMs, get lost in that. They go, oh, well, the customer says they need X. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but really understanding how they're going to use it, what problem they're trying to solve, is as important as the implementation of how you would go about it. So just
I will say, yeah, Rich, I think that's a really good point. And I will say, this is actually an interesting case of don't just record the tag. Actually, the larger your company, right? At a small company, the product person, right, will go in and want to talk to that customer and learn, because if they're a good product person, they'll actually want to get to the bottom of it, right? But at a larger company, that might not be possible anymore. So the person who captured that information, this is one of those cases where you want to take as detailed as possible of a log to go along with the, they asked for X, because your product team will not trust you otherwise, right? Because I think you're totally right that there's almost always something deeper there. And personally, as a product person, I love the qualitative paragraphs from the customer. I think that's actually really, really powerful.
No, it's cool. Yeah. And with call recording, I mean, Gong now is, however, with the double unicorn. I mean, the ability to do that very easily with technology as well is there too.
Totally.
I love this next question that came in, and Irene, I'm really sorry to make you wait, but I wanted to make sure we could give it time. So I'm going to paraphrase Irene's question here. A lot of usage data is kind of meaningless if it's not helping your customer unlock the value that they expect from investing in your solution. How do you capture that, the expectations that were set in the sales process, the key goals that the customer has in engaging with your solution? And how do you kind of report back on that to make sure that the company that bought got the results that they needed? A little bit of a different flavor of the data question.
No,
but,
that's really good.
Million dollar question, Irene. Very, very awesome question.
That's really good. I mean, the meta is revenue aligned with product at a higher level, right? Like, is your pricing and your revenue tied to the value that the product delivers? Which, not always one-to-one. Like, usually they trend in the same direction. They're not always perfectly aligned. So I think that's really, really good. So if you make the assumption that the product tiers or the pricing tiers are roughly aligned with what the product does, and so therefore revenue grows when product usage grows, then the question is identifying the right kind of product usage, because I think that's still a problem, right? So a lot of times I think here you do discover slight variations in what a product team or a growth team might want to track versus a customer success team. And I think the reason is when you zoom out to the product side, they care primarily about like the growth, right? Like overall, they're looking at almost everything as aggregates. And as a success person, you're looking at the individual, whether it's a person or an account. So you have to think about things slightly differently. But normally, what you want is the definition of active. Like, active should not be naive, right? Like, you start by starting. Active can be logged into the website. Cool. But you probably want to invest like the smartest minds in the company to find the most. You should be actually challenging yourself to give yourself the hardest definition of active possible. Like, not the one that grows nicely and easily. It should be, take Census, right? So Census helps you sync data. So we could have done active as logged in. Obviously, that seems like very little connection to value and revenue. We also could have done it to just volume of data, right? So, hey, how much data is syncing? That's pretty connected to the value you get from a product, right? However, it does not track growing engagement in our product, right? It only tracks that your usage is growing, like your company is growing. So like if you have 100x more users because COVID has made your company grow, great. Census is going to sync more data, and so you're getting more value, but you're not engaging with Census more. So we actually go one level deeper and track like how many objects are you creating in Census? In other words, how many individual syncs are you creating? That means you're actually engaged, right? That means this is a product you're coming back to and doing more things with. You're enabling more scenarios. You're going beyond just, I set up a sync and I moved on, which is still good. But that's our way of being tough on ourselves, of saying like, our customers might grow all by themselves. We can't just say that's why we're growing, right? Like we want to grow our share within that of like how valuable we are. So I think if you define that metric really, really well, then at least you're okay. That doesn't solve the problem if your revenue is totally disjoint from that, of like the only way you make money is through like, well, we sell SSO as a feature in the product, and like, do they use SSO? I think those are harder problems to kind of solve in a nice way, but also solvable, right? Like then you create a multi-point kind of definition of success, and this is where you go from one metric to a few metrics.
And I think,
but you better get your buy-in from the product team.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too. It comes back to being there's really high level strategic question, like, do you know who you're selling to? Do you know the value that they're unlocking from it? Is your product lined up with that? Is your pricing strategy lined up with that? Because you could, Boris, back to your point, like you could look at pricing for a platform a lot of different ways. Like I think sometimes of platforms and solutions it's almost like plumbing in a way. Like, does the toilet flush? I'm not going to complain I'm not going to call the plumber and be like, yo, it worked. Right. That was amazing. Right. So really thinking through what those are. And if folks want to go deeper on this, Mark Roberge's talk from our summit last month has a healthy amount of time on different stages of companies and how to think about this concept of what a successful user looks like, but then also pulling it forward into how do you incentivize your team to get those right behaviors, to get them acting in a way that lines up with what's going to derive the most value for your users, which puts you in the best position to be successful as a business. That's a talk in of itself for sure.
Yeah, I think it's a really fun topic. Hopefully I can follow up with her and we can get into it, because I think it's really, really interesting organizationally.
We nerd out on that one for a while. We hit on this a little bit, but it's probably worth it to double click into just a little bit more of like, who have you seen be involved in some of those definitions, right? Active user, at-risk user, sometimes people use the red, the amber, and the green rating. How have you seen organizations come together and solve for that? Because that's another silo. That's not a data silo, but that's more of a communication silo.
Yeah. So it's exactly what I was trying to say at the end there, which is, I think at the lowest level, this needs to be in alignment with, let's call it data team, product team, growth team, engineering team, et cetera. In that the lowest level definition of like they are doing something in the app, like there shouldn't be 5 definitions in the company, because that will lead to internal pain later, right? And it shouldn't be like the largest companies in the world are able to do this. Like you can zero in on a small definition of active. I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's better to just have one that we agree on. Where things differ between, let's say, sales ops, success ops kind of side versus, let's say, the product and growth side, is looking at the individual accounts, right? So this gets into maybe one of the hard problems that we help people tackle, which is like aggregating data correctly. Where some parts of the company will take that definition and do like, all right, select on the entire company and just look at those ratios of like how many users are doing that versus all users, right? That's not interesting to a customer success job, right? Your job is to grow the account. So you're looking at that account. Potentially you're only looking at the users in the account if you know already who the ICP is and who the champions are. Then you're really only narrowing on a human being, or like 5 human beings. So that's one place where you start to have to craft your own version of it. But it should ideally be the same underlying definition of like they created like, let's take Census, right? Like they made a sync, right? You don't want to split on like what is the actual activity in the product, especially because the engineering team is going to have to instrument the data anyway, and you really don't want them to disagree on your definition of how you're going to use it. But where things go hairier is the aggregation, right? And small note on that is, when you're collaborating with let's say a data team that you have, or a product team, or whoever if it goes like sales, let's say it's customer success to your sales ops team, or your CS ops team to the broader product and data team, you should expect getting a lot of 5 whys when you ask for unusual aggregations. So if you say, I want this metric, and they will go like, okay, but what do you mean? And a lot of times that's where things get hairy. Like, people get confused as to why it's a complicated question. Right? It's like, what do you mean? Just give me the number of times they did this. Number of times in what time frame? By what grouping, right? Like, that is where things get tripped up, and you should empathize with the other side, because they're trying to help you. And so sometimes you're just like, I don't care, but they don't know that you don't care. So it's just kind of getting more precise about those definitions is really key.
I think that's great, and I think we're almost here at time, Boris. So any last key takeaways or anything that you want folks to kind of head home with here today?
Sure. I think one thing I would say, because I don't know that we emphasize it, but I think we've talked around it, is start with fewer metrics. And it wins on a lot of factors, right? It's a lot easier to prioritize a team with a single metric. Then there's a ranking. It's like, here are your accounts ranked by this one number. We know that at a human level, it's simpler, right? It's easier to track as a manager your team and say, like, how are we doing on this metric? And let's make this metric go up, right? Like, that's a lot easier. These kinds of debates will occur around, what did you mean by active, or monthly, or I thought we were tracking that. Your number totally disagrees with our number. It'll happen. It always happens, right? And it's okay not to get it right on day one, but iterate for it to be correct, because otherwise the disagreements get very political. And that's a lot easier to do with fewer metrics rather than start with 12. And then you're like, well, they're all wrong. And this does happen that they're wrong. But the key is to have a good system for you to iterate on that. And that's where our software comes in, but also good relationships between the teams come in. So that's probably my obvious takeaway, is just like, some of these things are hard. Start with ideally one metric. Product activity is probably the one to start with, and then go from there. So you and I talked about features. That Atrium does this well, right? Where there's like 4 or 5 or 3, 4 different features that users can use, and those are tracked on the CS side. That's okay. Don't start with that on day one. Just, you can layer that in later. That's kind of my main advice for people.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And build the data-driven discipline, right? You don't run a
Exactly.
marathon by you start with a 5K. You don't just jump in and have never run before. I think that's really, really solid advice. Boris, this was, as a fellow data nerd, an ex-Max Microsoft, this was a lot of fun. It was a very informative topic, and I think it was great. Really, really great having you here as a speaker. Thank you again for the sponsorship. And then on behalf of the entire MSP community and the team behind the scenes, again, thank you for your time. I know I can only imagine how busy you are, but thank you so much for sharing your perspective, your best practices, your knowledge with us. It was phenomenal. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Excellent. And everyone, we will have this recording up shortly. Everybody stay safe and have a wonderful rest of your day.